Hey everyone, welcome back to Coach Hall Writes. In today's video, I'm going to be answering some of the most asked questions that I receive about the AP Lang exam. One common question that I receive is, how many body paragraphs do I actually need to write for each of my essays? A lot of times, students want to know if 2 is sufficient or if they really need 3 body paragraphs. Here's the thing, quality matters more than quantity. Because evidence and commentary is essentially 2/3 of your score for each of your essays, it's really important that you develop your claims by supporting them with evidence and commentary. So, generally speaking, I prefer to see 2 very well developed paragraphs as opposed to 3 mediocre ones. But it does depend. Some prompts might lend themselves more to 2 paragraphs, whereas other prompts might lend themselves to 3 body paragraphs. It really depends on the argument that you're trying to make. So, regardless of whether you decide to do 2 body paragraphs or 3 body paragraphs, really focus on developing your commentary and creating a strong line of reasoning. You can do this by having an effective topic sentence, layers of evidence and commentary, and a concluding sentence. Use that concluding sentence to tie back to your thesis. It might seem a bit formulaic, but for a timed essay, I promise it helps. Now, what about your introduction? How long should your intro actually be for each of the AP Lang essays? Here's the thing. Technically, your intro can just be a defensible thesis. So if you are panicking or you're running out of time or you just don't know how to start your essay, I would highly recommend skipping a couple lines and just writing that defensible thesis. By skipping a couple lines, you leave room for yourself to go back to it and add more if you want to. But if you're not able to, there's no penalty for skipping down a couple lines on your paper. Remember that the important part of the intro is your thesis statement. Technically, it can be found anywhere in your essay, but think of your thesis as a promise to your reader. It helps your reader understand what you're about to say in the body paragraphs if the thesis comes first in the intro. So, if all else fails, get a defensible thesis down on your paper. Now, if you're able to, I personally do recommend writing about 3 sentences for your intro, usually a couple sentences of context before your actual thesis. I think this is especially important for the rhetorical analysis essay, if at all possible, because sometimes it is a little bit jarring to just read an essay that only has a thesis as the intro. But like I said, there are certain situations where it might not benefit you to spend a lot of time trying to write an intro. In those cases, the one sentence thesis is just fine. Now, what about conclusions? Do you actually need a conclusion? Well, technically not, because it's not anywhere on the rubric that you need one. Now, obviously, for out of class assignments that are not a timed essay where you have way longer than 40 minutes, then yes, you should have a conclusion. However, for the AP Lang exam, it's usually better to focus on your body paragraphs. While a conclusion can be nice, sometimes students only have time for a very simplistic conclusion that doesn't actually help their essay. Some things to think about with a conclusion, though, are, do I have a defensible thesis already? If you're not sure, then take the time to restate your thesis using slightly different words to make sure that it's defensible. Sometimes students have a much stronger thesis at the end of their essay as opposed to the beginning. Keep in mind that a defensible thesis doesn't have to be strong, you just have to be able to prove the claim. That being said, if you write a stronger one in your conclusion, you are perhaps ending your essay on a better note. But let's say you do have time for a conclusion. What do you actually need to include in order to make it a strong conclusion? I recommend situating the issue in a broader context. For rhetorical analysis, ask yourself, why is this message or argument relevant to society today? Or examine the historical implications of the passage itself. For argument essays and also synthesis essays, think about why the issue is actually important. How does this issue impact society? What are the short-term and long-term benefits? If you're looking for more tips about conclusions, I do have a couple videos on my channel. Be sure to check out the iCards above and also the description box below for those videos. But like I said, conclusions are not necessary. They can be useful if you have time. Now, if you're running out of time and you have a really good idea for your conclusion, I have actually seen some of my own students use this as additional commentary at the very end of their last body paragraph. And sometimes that can work really well as well because they didn't really have time to separate their conclusion and develop it the way they wanted to, but they were able to put that insight in as additional commentary in a body paragraph. More recently, I've received a lot of questions about a closed thesis. So, can you actually write one? The answer is yes. Now, you might be wondering, okay, wait a minute, what is a closed thesis statement? I've never heard this term. A closed thesis indicates the main points of the essay. Honestly, a lot of students learn a closed thesis in early elementary school, and as you progress throughout high school and into college, you might be writing longer papers, and a closed thesis might not be appropriate for those papers. You might want a more open thesis that doesn't spell out all of your main points. Here's the thing though, the AP Lang essays are approximately 40 minutes, and you're writing under duress. So, a closed thesis is not only allowable, but in some cases, it's beneficial because it gives you a blueprint of what you're going to write about. Also, for what it's worth, a defensible thesis is usually very easy for an AP reader to recognize. But closed thesis statements sometimes get a bad reputation, especially from some teachers. And here's why. Some teachers think they're simplistic or formulaic, and I will admit that that's true. But I also think it's important to remember that it's a timed essay and it's viewed as a rough draft. And we also need to be careful not to assume that all closed thesis statements are going to be simplistic. There are different ways to make a closed thesis statement insightful. If you want more information about how to write a thesis statement for your AP Lang essays, I do have a playlist about all the different types of thesis statements, and I give some examples and sentence frames. Because one thing you don't want to do is spend a ton of time crafting your thesis. You want a defensible thesis, yes, but you also want to save time for those body paragraphs. Now let's move into some essay specific questions. So, one question for the synthesis essay that I receive quite often is how many sources am I supposed to include in each paragraph? For a synthesis essay, you need to cite 3 total sources throughout your essay. So, if for whatever reason you are running out of time and you only have cited 2 sources, make sure you get a third source in there. For my own students, I usually encourage them to try to include 4 sources just in case they forget to cite one or something happens. But again, that's a recommendation, not a rule. Now, as far as how many sources go in each paragraph, this is just an observation, and I'm sure there's exceptions to this. However, I have found that the essays that have 2 sources per paragraph tend to have a stronger line of reasoning because they're creating a conversation of sources. In contrast, essays that have, let's say, 3 body paragraphs and each body paragraph has 1 source tend to have a weaker line of reasoning. Now, these are just generalizations, though. So, here are a couple things to consider. It is possible that you might have 2 sources in one paragraph and one in the next, and your essay could still be very good. It's also important to realize that you can cite the same source in 2 separate paragraphs, especially if that source is proving 2 separate main ideas that you have. So, overall, be mindful of creating that conversation. Look for how the sources overlap. Do they have similarities by talking about similar topics? Does one source kind of build off of another? Or is there a contrasting relationship? Because sometimes you can pair 2 sources together because you're able to set up a counterclaim and rebuttal. For rhetorical analysis, one of the most common questions I've received since at least 2020 is which choices do I need to know? I received this question so much that I actually created a video about it. It is a bit older and I'll probably update it at some point, but I think the information in the video is still valid. Here's the thing, we need to understand what a rhetorical choice is. A rhetorical choice is what the writer intentionally does. Usually, choices are conveyed by verbs, whereas devices or strategies are conveyed through nouns. I've seen several students write essays in which they write about the appeals, logos, ethos, and pathos. Sometimes I've even seen essays where there was one paragraph about logos, one about pathos, and one about ethos. I would discourage this particular format because logos, ethos, and pathos are appeals and not choices. So I'm not saying you can't write about them. You can absolutely write about the appeals, but here's what you want to remember. Choices create appeals. So if you notice something is logical, ask yourself, why is it logical? Is it because of statistics or facts or examples? If that's the case, then write about those statistics, facts, or examples and talk about why they're logical as opposed to making a claim like the writer uses logos. If you want more information about how to write about appeals effectively and connect it to a rhetorical choice, then check out this video here that I will link in the iCards above and the description box below. It's all about writing about appeals. But let's get back to the original question. Which choices do you need to know? There are some that are pretty common. And so if you're looking for a starting point, here is a brief, not entirely inclusive list. Examples, facts, repetition, comparison, contrast, anecdotes, and allusions. Now, are there other choices out there? Absolutely. For instance, you could look at word choice and tone. Technically speaking, every passage has word choice and tone, they work together. But let's think about it a different way too. There are other choices things that the writer is doing that aren't necessarily repetition or comparison. For instance, the writer might be incorporating humor, or they might flatter their audience, or they might criticize their audience. They might try to rally their audience, or they might even be trying to create a common enemy. These are all choices too. So, if you're looking to improve the quality of your writing, focus on rhetorically accurate verbs and also recognize that while I did give you a brief list here, it is, in fact, a brief list. While these are some common devices and choices that might come up in a passage, don't go looking for those choices specifically because these choices are not going to be in every passage. And sometimes you might see a choice like repetition, but it might not be as significant as something else that the writer is doing in that section. So we want to be really careful. We want to be informed about what a choice is, but we don't want to project our knowledge of choices onto the passage. We want to read the passage and ask ourselves, hey, what is the writer doing here? Not, oh, hey, where's the comparison? Because sometimes there isn't one. Another question that I get very often is, can I write about personal experience? So the answer to this really does depend on the essay that we're talking about. For a synthesis, yes, you can as long as it's relevant commentary. So some of the prompts tend to lend themselves to this more than others. For instance, last year on the exam in 2021, the prompt was about cursive writing. Many students had a connection with this. Previous prompts, like the one about libraries, same thing. You might have relevant personal experience. But then there have been some other topics where students might not have personal experience. I'm thinking of the eminent domain prompt, for instance. So, if the personal experience is relevant and you can convey it in a meaningful and concise way to add commentary, then yes, go for it. But no, you don't cite yourself as a source. You have to use the provided sources to get those 3 citations. For rhetorical analysis, no, we don't want you to write about personal experience because you're supposed to be analyzing a passage. Now, a slight manipulation of this could occur in the conclusion if you're trying to situate the issue in a broader context. You might then connect it to society, but even then, we're not really talking about personal experience at that point. So the answer is no, we should not write about personal experience in rhetorical analysis because you were not there for the speech, presumably, nor is the letter being addressed to you. So focus on the task at hand. What are the choices and how does it help the writer convey their message, argument, or purpose? Now, for an argument essay, yes, you can absolutely write about personal experience. And some of the College Board's prompts, they do actually reference experience. So, yes, you can write about personal experience. Just be concise about the context, make sure it is clear what you're talking about, but really focus on the deeper meaning of the experience and how it helps prove your thesis. For instance, you might use an example of an adversity you faced in order to show personal growth. Now, I have a separate video on this as well if you're curious about how to write about personal experience for argument essays and see what that could look like. But the key is making sure that it's a meaningful experience, not something trivial. Now, let's talk about the biggest FRQ mistakes. So, FRQ is free response question. I sometimes call it the essays. I think the biggest mistake overall that I see is a lack of commentary. Remember that each claim you make should have evidence and ideally more commentary than evidence. So, this could be 2 sentences of commentary, it could be 4 sentences of commentary. It really depends on what you're talking about and how you write those sentences. But make sure that you are explaining the significance of your evidence, analyzing its importance. Now, there are a couple quick tips for commentary. Use words like because or since. Use verbs like illustrates, highlights, suggests, but really make sure you're proving why your evidence matters. And even if you think it's really obvious, say it anyway, because the writers have to go by what's on the page. For rhetorical analysis, I think one of the biggest mistakes I've seen, especially last year as an AP reader for one of the RA prompts, was that students are not connecting the choice to the rhetorical situation. You want to ask yourself, how does this choice relate to the message, purpose, or argument? Because each prompt is going to ask you about one of those. For rhetorical analysis with the stable wording, you're now going to see convey a message, achieve a purpose, or develop an argument. Really make sure as you're writing your essay that within each body paragraph, you are addressing the message, purpose, and argument. I especially recommend this for a concluding sentence of the paragraph. Make sure you're tying back to your thesis. You also want to ask yourself, why does the speaker make this choice for this audience on this occasion? We really want to think about that speaker audience connection and also the occasion. This could be the context or the exigence. Basically, it boils down to why are they making these choices? If you can include that analysis in your essay, chances are you're connecting to the rhetorical situation, which will improve your score. For argument, I think the biggest thing that I see is that students do not include specific evidence. So we want to avoid generalizations and hypotheticals. You want to be able to provide concrete information such as specific names or dates. Now, do you have to have the exact date? No. Could you say recent event if you don't know the year? Yes, that's true. You could do that. But make sure that you know appropriate background info and make sure you're explaining how that example actually relates to the prompt. Now, with synthesis and argument, a common question that I receive is, do I really need a counterclaim? The answer is no. Can it help you get sophistication? Yes. I believe that it's important for students to know how to construct a counterclaim and rebuttal or concession and refutation, but I don't think it's mandatory to include it in your synthesis or argument essay. Part of the reason why is because you only have 40 minutes, and sometimes students address a counterclaim and it actually weakens their argument, or at the very least, it's not convincing. So, in a timed essay, really think about the main points that are proving your thesis and ask yourself, is addressing the counter argument actually going to help my argument? Because a one sentence counterclaim and rebuttal, it can be a nice addition, but it's not going to help you earn the sophistication point. And I think sometimes students try to address the counter argument in hopes of earning the sophistication point. But remember that sophistication has to happen throughout the entire essay. So don't force addressing the counter argument if your time would be better spent just proving the other main points in your essay. If you do have time to effectively address the counter argument and you do think it will help your argument, then go for it. It can be at the beginning of your essay, it can be at the end of your essay. Just make sure that it is logical and that it's really truly helping your argument. Don't just put it in there for the sake of doing so. If you're looking for more resources, in addition to the YouTube videos that I have on this channel, I would love it if you would follow me over on TikTok as well. I'm at Coach Hall Writes on both platforms. And if you're looking for even more resources than that, I do have some upcoming student study sessions that are totally free. I will leave the information for those in the description box below. And as always, until next time, happy writing.